I mean, you don't want to put pressure on the relationship, but before you get to the part where the invitations are sent and the wedding venue is booked and the airplane tickets for the out-of-towners are bought, before you get to all of that, you should be having this discussion about the prenuptial agreement.
Welcome to The Details with Allison Kahler, a space for real divorce stories and grounded conversations with experts, helping you find clarity and courage as you step into a future that may look different than you expected and better than you thought possible. My guest today is Lisa Zeiderman. Lisa is a New York-based matrimonial attorney who specializes in complex, high-net-worth divorces. So she's the perfect person to dive into all of the lessons learned coming out of Belle Burden's memoir, Strangers, which everybody has been talking about. Today, we talk about, yes, prenuptial agreements, but also something you may be less familiar with, postnuptial agreements. Let's get into my conversation with Lisa. Welcome to The Details, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Allison, for having me. I'm so excited to be talking with you today.
I'm so excited to be talking to you because we are going to unpack together Belle Burden's latest memoir, Strangers, which has just totally captured the cultural zeitgeist over the past few months. And whether you're divorcing or married, everyone seems to be talking about this book.
It's a fabulous book. I will say I read it to cover in just a few days, and it was an amazing book. Amazing. So I think it's got lots of good information, lots of lessons, and a very interesting story to it.
Well, you are the perfect person to help us unpack all of the learnings in it because you are a divorce lawyer, a certified divorce financial analyst, and you work with a lot of high net worth individuals in New York. So stories like Belle's are ones that come across your office pretty regularly, right?
Yes, they do. This is, as I was reading it, I'm thinking to myself, this is so many of our clients, past, present. This is our client. So absolutely.
So what do you think is so striking about this story? Why is it captivating the attention of so many people right now?
So I think that people can relate to it, right? I think that they can relate to Belle's story and what happened to her and how, frankly, she ended up where she ended up in terms of this. Now, I will say she ended up in a very good place at the end, right? Writing this huge book that has been a major success, undoubtedly, and is going to be a movie. But I think that people can relate to how she felt, why she did the things that she did, and that is so many women's stories that we see. So I think it's relatable.
Yeah, this concept of sort of being blindsided, and even now she talks about not knowing what happened or being able to really dissect that. Does that happen pretty commonly for your clients?
So it does. I think it happens both male and female. I'm going to say that, right?
Yeah.
I think that a lot of times one person is just way ahead of the curve in terms of wanting a divorce. And one person has maybe one foot out the door or maybe both feet out the door. And the other person is kind of left scrambling to get to kind of catch up, to understand what's happening, to accept what's happening to them. And so it's a much more difficult, I think, process for the person who is left to scramble and catch up and plan, because the other person has had time to think it out usually and has had time to make plans.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure Belle has her own lessons learned looking back with hindsight. But if this is a cautionary tale for others that might find themselves in their situation, help us unpack what are some of the things you saw in Belle's story that other people can learn from.
So I think that the story actually is consistent throughout the narrative. I think that the story starts before they're ever married, before the couple is ever married, and Belle is asked by her then fiancé to change the prenup. The prenup had been a prenup that Belle's family had used for ages and ages, right? And very often we see that where the prenup repeats itself again and again for family members. And Belle was asked specifically to change the prenuptial agreement and to make adjustments so that the assets that are placed in one party's name became that party's asset. and the assets that were placed in joint names became joint. And so at the very last minute, and I will say it was the last minute, right after probably having seen this prenuptial agreement many, many times, her then fiance asked Belle to make the switch. And instead of following the advice of her counsel, right, she decided to go ahead, follow her gut, make the switch because she was madly in love with her husband. And therein lied the first problem, right? And the next thing that happens is, well, there is a variety of things that happen, but at some point, she again is faced during the book with a decision that has to be made, with a meeting that's going to take place to discuss their wills and also what she believes is going to be a modification to the prenuptial agreement or a postnup. I would say it would probably be a postnuptial agreement. And at the very last minute, once again, her husband says to her, let's not discuss that today. And so that discussion is off the table. And it was a discussion that was very important to Belle, but she decided not to have that discussion. Now, in between, Belle also was asked to make or decided to make certain contributions to joint property from her assets. And when I say her assets, they truly were her assets. They were gifts either from her family or inheritances that she had received. And they were definitely, without a question, her separate property under the prenuptial agreement and her separate property, even if there had been no prenuptial agreement. Yeah. And when she took those separate assets from her trust and she put them into both the home in the vineyard and the New York apartment, she lost their separate property character because according to the prenuptial agreement, they then became joint assets. And so the assets that her family, frankly, had given her that they probably had worked very hard for, right, during their lifetime, all of a sudden became joint property and of both of the parties. And that was a major disappointment as you're reading the book. I'll say that from my point of view. And I kept thinking to myself, where was counsel? I'm sure that they advised her. And where was the part where the trustee probably said, don't do it, okay? Yeah. But that wasn't in the book. But then that became joint property. And then that became something that she was really had to fight and for to be able to have those places as her own. And then there was one last thing that I always think about, which was the moment when she was offered a position at a company that she wanted to work for. And she spoke to her husband about it, and he basically, in sum and substance, said what we hear so many times, which is, no, you don't really need to do that. You don't need to work. I'll take care of you. I've always taken care of you. No problem. And so she gives up the job opportunity and the ability to earn and puts herself in a position that is very difficult because she has then lost a lot of control that she could have actually regained through that working position.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, when you lay it out like that, you're like, well, duh, you shouldn't have done these things. But what do you think gets in the way, whether it's, in Belle's case specifically, or just the other clients that you see? What are the reasons why we fall into these traps?
I think generally people sometimes have a very difficult time, particularly women, having conversations about money. Yeah. And I think that they feel that they want to please their spouse. And so they're more apt to do that than to necessarily listen to their counsel. And they're in love. And Belle was very, she felt she was happily married. She's raising these children. She's having a really nice life. Her husband is very successful and is on the rise. And she really couldn't imagine, I think, the fact that one day there could be a divorce, there could be another woman, there could be a reason that her husband leaves, and that she is left to then scramble to pick up the pieces of the things that she probably shouldn't have done. And I think women in general may be pleasers in some way, and they want to please their spouse. And I think she felt that this was her way of contributing to the family by giving this separate property over and the monies from her trust to be able to buy this home in New York, to be able to buy this home in Martha's Vineyard that the parties had so enjoyed and their children, and to make it part of the family. And when you do that, I think you have to think once, twice, and then listen to your attorney.
Yeah. And so talk to us a little bit about the prenup phase and getting one. So Belle and her husband actually had a prenup in place. Many people don't even have one to begin with. So talk to us about, first of all, who should get a prenup? And then secondly, what makes a good prenup?
So I think Basically, everyone should have a prenup. I
Really?
think it's the
Even
law.
the not high net worth individuals of the
Yes.
world? Okay.
I really wish that we had actually a law in the United States, certainly in New York, that everybody gets a prenup
Mm,
because I think that it really causes people to have difficult conversations and to think about certain things that they may not have thought about, right?
yeah.
And I think that these are the money conversations and the conversations about what life is going to be like, whether you're talking about who's going to contribute what, inheritance, who's coming into the marriage with assets, who's not coming into marriage with assets, your hopes, your dreams, your views about who should stay home with children or who should not, who should pursue
Yeah.
careers. I think it's such a good conversation to have. And, I'm seeing more and more, Allison, that there are therapists actually who are working with people as they negotiate through their prenuptial agreement as well. And because it's not so, sometimes it's some of these difficult conversations, but you are learning so much about the person that you're going to live with for the rest of your life. And so if you never ever have to use this prenuptial agreement, I think it
Yeah.
is an unbelievable source of information to learn about the person you're going to marry.
Yeah. Well, and why do you think people don't get one in the first place? Like, what holds them back from, besides being uncomfortable talking about money? Like, what are some of the reasons why people don't get one?
I think they don't need them. They can't ever picture that they're going to divorce this person that they're madly in love with and
Yeah.
soon to be married. I think that some people just don't even know it's a possibility, that it's something that you can do under the law, and that in most, if not all states in the United States, it would be upheld. I think the idea of divorce for some is just so out of the question that they find it unnecessary to even have a discussion about it. We see more and more people who are actually coming to us for prenuptial agreements. But the reason I think that we're seeing a large rise in prenuptial agreements is not just that there's more discussion about them, but also people do not want their parents' divorce.
Mm,
They do not want, they may have been the children who actually were part of the custody battle, right? And you cannot use a prenuptial agreement to determine custody if the child is unborn. So I'm just going to say that. But
yeah.
they remember, okay, being dragged through these divorces. They remember
Yeah.
how mad it all was and maddening it was and how long it took and how difficult it was. And they are coming to us because they want to avoid the same thing.
Yeah. And I actually heard a stat on another podcast that you were on that something like, I think the number was 47% of Gen Z and millennials that are engaged or marrying have prenups now. That sort of shocked me how high that number was, because I think the number by comparison was something like 5% years and years ago. So I think that point that you mentioned as the resident data nerd is, I was like, people are really catching on to this and doing it more and more now, which is great to hear. But then also this, I think if I speak for myself, like I didn't think I was going to be part of the statistic, right? You hear all these numbers about people getting divorced, but I was like, oh, that's certainly not going to be me. Right. And so I think, a term that I used in business all the time is hope is not a strategy. And, so I think, regardless if you're a smart person, you're putting this in place, you can just get this as something that's a sort of insurance policy to help you down the line if it ever needed to be in place.
Right. I mean, many times people don't use the insurance, right, that
Yeah.
they actually have paid for, but nonetheless, they have the insurance, right? What about disability insurance? You hope you're never going to be disabled, but you still have disability insurance
Yeah.
because if you will need it, then you want to have it.
Yeah.
And I think it's very much so like that for a prenuptial agreement. I also think that people don't understand, and I think this is another reason, that prenups are not just if you have a great deal of money. Prenups actually can protect you in the event that you don't come into the marriage with a great deal of money, or that you aren't going to be a high earner and perhaps your spouse is the person who's going to be a higher earner. There's this idea and this myth that the high earner is going to want the prenup, that the high earner is going to, force me to sign the prenup, that the person
Mhm.
with a lot of net worth is going to force me to sign the prenup or be advocating for a prenup. But the fact is that if you have good counsel and a good advocate, and if you're open to negotiating a prenuptial agreement and think about what life is going to be like, and listen to your counsel, it could be so advantageous to have a prenuptial agreement so that you can negotiate for your future, so that you are not left in a situation, frankly, where somebody who comes in with a lot of separate property maybe doesn't work as hard, maybe wants a stay-at-home parent, and you become that stay-at-home parent, and now you're looking at 20 or 30 years of marriage, and you're really scrambling to figure out how you're going to support yourself because you didn't have that prenuptial agreement.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of the lessons learned you've had through the law and everything have come from your own personal experience. So you weren't always a lawyer. Tell us a little bit about your origin story and what brought you here.
So I was not always a lawyer. When I came out of high school, I decided to go into the fashion business, much to my parents' chagrin at that point. And I decided not to go to college. And so I went into the fashion business and I worked for a manufacturer on 7th Avenue. And then I always had a very entrepreneurial spirit. So I opened up my own showroom on 7th Avenue and I was representing young designers. And then at some point I went through my divorce, right? I never thought I would get divorced either. My parents had never been divorced. I don't think anybody in my family had ever been divorced. And so I went through my own divorce and then ended up, as I was going through it, thinking to myself, I really like this in terms of the practice of law, and that I could do this and that I could actually be good at this, because there was a lot of negotiation, which I was doing in the fashion business and advocating and all of those things. So I wasn't actually advocating for markdown money or advocating against markdown money, but I would be advocating for alimony or for support or for child support or some sort of a equitable distribution of assets. And so I could see the translation of why I would be good at this. And I also felt that I could be very responsive to clients. And that was my main complaint, frankly, as I went through my divorce, is people weren't responding. The attorneys weren't responding, no matter how fast I would write the checks. They still wouldn't be responding. And so I was thinking to myself, this is insane, right? That I would do this. And so I got my undergraduate degree after my divorce and then my law degree. And then I worked for a matrimonial solo practitioner and then decided I really wanted to litigate, worked for a bigger firm, and then decided to open my own firm in 2013 and built it, frankly, from 4 people to about 50 people now.
Wow, quite the story. And in terms of the clientele that you work with, how does that reflect your own personal experience, or has that shaped the work that you've done?
So I'm a litigator. It's part of me. There's no question.
I can kind of tell from you, Lisa.
There's no question, right? I can settle your case. I can negotiate your case, and I do. Okay, I settle and negotiate a lot of cases. But I think that I feel like you have to settle and negotiate cases from a point of strength, which means you need to craft the case from the day you actually get it, from that very first consult, and make sure that you are making your case so that if you end up in the courtroom or you end up in a trial or you end up in a place where the negotiation fails, that you're not left basically hanging, that you know what your next step is. And so for me, it's very important to craft the case and to put the case together. And my experience level is that you have to be prepared. And that is our biggest motto here, is that you need to be prepared.
And so how does a prenup factor into the preparation? And you mentioned earlier with Belle's story, this concept of a postnup. So how does that actually play in once you're in a divorce process?
So a postnup, first of all, just going back to a postnuptial agreement. A postnuptial agreement in many states is a enforceable document, not in all states. So we just have to be mindful of that. Mm-hmm. But in New York, for example, it is enforceable. And if you forgot to do the prenup, or you were too embarrassed to have the discussion about the money, or you felt that it would just be taken in the wrong context, or any of those things, and you get to a place in your marriage that you feel like you want to stay married, but this isn't going well financially for whatever reason, right? You feel like you could be in a situation where you're not in a good financial place later. Maybe somebody's spending too much, by the way. Maybe somebody is saving too little. Maybe there's other issues going on. It may be time to have a conversation with your attorney or an attorney who is knowledgeable about postnuptial agreements and ask, is there something I can do? Because maybe I don't want to get divorced. Maybe I really am in love with my spouse, but I can't sustain the financial situation the way it is. And so you can actually do basically what a prenup would have done, right? You can go and draft and set forth terms that you then feel comfortable with and that you feel like you actually have essentially secured your financial future in a way that you can actually focus on the marriage and the building of the marriage or rebuilding of the marriage. And so a lot of people actually do these postnuptial agreements, and they are becoming more and more popular, actually.
So here's a question for you. Let's say you're not fully decided that you're going on divorce, but you're starting to question. You're like, my marriage isn't in a great spot and I don't have a prenup and I'm getting a little freaked out about the money. What does someone do in that case? Is a postnuptial agreement relevant for that person? Or if they think it's headed for a divorce, is that not a good step to take in the interim?
No, it could be very relevant for a person to, at that point, actually enter into a postnuptial agreement, because I'm going to say that the financial issues are a huge reason that people get divorced.
Yeah.
And so maybe if you actually enter into a postnuptial agreement, if you take care of the financial pressures and alleviate them, then you will no longer have some of the issues that are in your marriage. And I've had people who have come to me because of financial issues and they just don't feel secure. Either somebody is spending too much or not saving or doing things that they don't want to do with their finances, or maybe somebody's not earning. I mean, that's an issue, right? We've had situations where people just refuse to work. Well, that's fine if they're not working, but if I'm working 24/7 to keep us all together and I'm not able, now I'm going to have to split the money that I actually I'm saving, right? The finances that I'm saving because of my hard work, and the other person is saying, I don't want to go to work, even though I'm saying go to work, right?
Yeah.
It takes two. Then they need to actually take responsibility for their decisions. And the other person who's working shouldn't be responsible. Yeah. And so this is a good place to do it, is in a postnuptial agreement.
I've definitely heard of people recently, just through doing the podcast and speaking to people, that they're opting for sort of alternative arrangements and not getting divorced because they think it's financially untenable to actually go through this divorce process, that not only the cost of the divorce process itself, but just what it would look like to split assets, get different households, all of these things. And so finances becomes a huge thing. I frankly had never even heard of the term postnuptial divorce before we started talking.
So it's called a postnuptial agreement.
Yeah.
And it's not that you're getting divorced. It's that you're not getting divorced, right? That you are trying to, and this is actually the reason for a postnup, is to enhance the marriage, right? Yeah. And the way that you enhance the marriage is actually to take the pressure off, right? It's like a pressure cooker at some point, and you need to take the pressure off. And the way that you do that is to start to have that money conversation and start to find out, what is the other person uncomfortable about? Why is the other person so angry, right? Why is the other person feeling like I'm not doing my share, or I'm doing too much, right? And you're not doing enough. And, why should I keep nagging you to go to work?
Yeah.
Okay. You don't want to go to work. That's fine. But then I'm saving the money, and I want to know, if we do get divorced, that I'm going to have that savings because I've decided to go to work. And you know what? If you're okay living on very little and you can just survive on, that's great. You make that choice for yourself. Right. Yeah. And then all of a sudden that pressure is off. And maybe now the other person who wants to not work, right, is looking more fun instead of looking like somebody, right, who is draining the person who's working.
So I totally buy the concept that this could enhance a marriage. And at the same time, I also feel like it could be seen as drinking celery juice in the morning or something like that. It's good for your health. You should do it, but it doesn't sound fun. And so for the person that may be thinking, hey, this postnuptial agreement would probably help our marriage, et cetera, what's the way to approach that conversation with the overspending spouse, et cetera, in a way that doesn't drive complete rejection?
So it's a great question. I think that it's about financial transparency. And I'm going to bet that the person who feels that the spending is too much, okay, has said it 1,000,000 times, right? And somebody hasn't heard that person. So I think it's a conversation. Maybe it's over a glass of wine and even a nice dinner. I really love you. I really want to spend the rest of my life with you. But, Okay, I can't do that under the current circumstances.
Yeah.
And from my point of view, your spending is out of control. From your point of view, it's perfectly reasonable. We clearly have a difference in opinion here, and we need to fix this difference in opinion, and we need to actually document it so that it's a legal binding contract.
Yeah.
And I think once we get that off the table, then we can go on and enjoy many dinners together, right? And many, many fun things together, but I cannot live like this. And so if we're going to continue to be together, and I want to continue to be together, then this is what we need to do.
Yeah. Well, what I love about this path is like I could just sort of feel myself like exhaling, relaxing as you're talking about this, because I think money can be so scary in a marriage and in a divorce process. And if you're not one of those 47% of people that has gotten a prenup somewhat recently, it can be really scary to think about like, oh shit, like what's really at stake through this process. And to know that there are other decisions that are available, other legal processes that could be useful is really helpful. So as we think about some advice, and I know you're not positioning any sort of legal advice here, can't do that on a podcast, but with that caveat, there's sort of two people I imagine that we could be speaking to today. One are the people that don't have a prenup in place and they might be considering, I'm not really sure where my marriage is going. What would you say to those people? And then also the second group of people are the people that are post-divorce and maybe they've had a nasty financial process. Like if they're thinking about getting remarried down the line, what would you want them to be thinking about as they go through that the second time?
Okay, so let's take the people first who are married, who are thinking like, where is this all going? And then we'll talk to people who are post-divorce and thinking of getting remarried, right? That's our two categories. Okay. So I think the people who are currently married and aren't happy. So look, it's kind of like you ask the shoemaker, should I fix the shoes? There is a little bit of that. Okay. And I will say, a very high bar for marriage. Okay. As I've told you, Allison, I'm married 28 years. I'm madly in love with my husband. He's my second husband. We have never had a fight, believe it or not, in our 28 years. Okay.
What?
We have never had a fight. Okay. We think the same way. Some people say we have one mind with two bodies. Okay. And I think that's somehow true. But I will say that for those people, right, they need to start to think about whether this is a marriage that they want to be in. Okay. Mm-hmm. And my bar is very high. If I woke up next to the person who I'm sleeping with and wake up in the morning and I'm not like madly in love, I would think to myself, like, what's going on here? Right. Because I wake up every morning and I'm really grateful to be with my husband. Okay. I'll say that. So I think the first question is, do you want to be with this person? Because life is short. And if it's not working, if you're always angry, if you're upset, all of those things, then maybe this isn't the right thing for you. And if that's the case, then a postnuptial agreement is not going to fix that problem.
Yeah.
But if this is someone that you are actually madly in love with, okay, or want to stay married to for other reasons, whatever those reasons are, then a postnuptial agreement may be a discussion that you should have with your spouse. And maybe the way that I outlined it or another way, right? And you can speak to your therapist about it. You could speak to your financial advisor about it. There are other people who you could speak to get some ideas about what this could look like, right? And you also said that people sometimes don't want to get divorced because they don't want necessarily to lose their assets, or it's just too expensive to live two separate lives, or people stay in a marriage sometimes because their children, they don't want to miss seeing one moment of their children. And that is very often what we see. And then people get divorced when their kids are going off to college. So that is a very common thing. But I think you have to really ask yourself, do you want to stay in this marriage? What's the goal here? And is this a place that you want to be for the foreseeable future? And if so, then how do I make it better? And maybe a postnuptial agreement may be one of the ways to make it better. Not the only way, but one of the ways, right? Yeah. And then I think for the people who are now post-divorce, right, who are thinking about new relationships, et cetera, that was your other question, correct? They have to start thinking if they're going to go into a new relationship, right, and a new marriage, they should be entering into a prenuptial agreement when they do it, because likely they have spent a good amount of time and money and effort, right, dealing with the division of assets, dealing with support, going through this once. They do not need to go through this twice, okay? Yeah. And they do not need to rebuy their house or essentially rebuy their jewelry or rebuy all of those things another time yet, right? That's what it's like, right? And they should make sure that their prenuptial agreement is together and that they are very clear on what their responsibilities are and whether or not they can live up to those responsibilities. And they should hire a good advocate.
Yeah. Well, you're 28 years happily married on the other side. I'm curious if you're willing to share. Did you have a prenup in your first marriage, and did you have one for your second marriage?
So I did not have a prenup for my first marriage. I do have one for my second marriage.
See, she takes her own medicine, ladies and gentlemen. Well, Lisa, we've learned so much from you today. Is there any sort of parting words of wisdom that you have to share with folks as they might be in this situation?
So I think that people should start to learn about what prenups are about, what postnuptial agreements are about, educate themselves. There's so much information on both of them. Mm-hmm. I think that give yourself the time. If you are going to get a prenuptial agreement, give yourself the amount of time that you need to negotiate it, to think about it, to discuss it. I will say springing it on your spouse just a few weeks before the wedding, not a good idea. Okay, not a good idea to spring these out. Okay, lots of times people hold back on them, and then all of a sudden we see people like 4 weeks before the wedding, they're coming to our office like with this prenup that's been drafted, that I know has been drafted for 6 months. Maybe it's like Belle's prenuptial agreement. It's been in the drawer. It's been used by every family member, right? But the fact is that it's very important that you give time. And that you have the discussion, and that it should be an ongoing discussion as you're getting serious about somebody, that there's going to be a prenuptial agreement. I don't want you to not know that this is going to be happening. And so discussing this and being open about it, really important so that it's not a surprise. And then as to the postnuptial agreement, again, educate yourself, decide if this is a marriage that is important to you and that you want to stay in this marriage. And if so, then maybe the postnuptial agreement is the answer if you didn't sign your prenuptial agreement. And by the way, dust off your prenuptial agreement, right? If you have a prenuptial agreement, read it, right? Because I'm going to say this. So many times people come to us and they haven't looked at it. They haven't read it. They don't know what it says. They didn't follow it, which is the worst thing that of all, right? Such a disappointment. They did things that were contrary to it, like Belle did, right? So dust it off.
Yeah. I don't even think she could find her. She went and looked for it. She went and looked for it in a box in her basement and couldn't find it or something. So.
She could not. And that was the thing about it. And that's why I'm saying dust it off. Exactly. Her husband was searching for it, if you recall, in the basement. She found him searching for it. This is actually an important document. And I will say this. Sometimes people have them. They don't follow them. And it costs them millions and millions of dollars.
Oh, my God. Millions of dollars. All right. Well, that's the cautionary tale. Last question for you, Lisa. If you're going to bring it up, when should you bring it up and how should you bring it up in terms of broaching the topic of a prenup with a potential future spouse?
So early, right? It should be part of the conversation early. So, just as you're dating, have you ever talked about a prenuptial agreement? Has anybody ever done a prenuptial agreement? I always have been told by my family I will have to have a prenuptial agreement. I mean, you don't want to put pressure on the relationship, but early, and certainly, when the conversation about engagement starts to happen, when you're looking at rings, when you're doing all of that, I'm going to need a prenuptial agreement. I want you to know that, before you get to the part where the invitations are sent and the wedding venue is booked and the airplane tickets for the out-of-towners are bought, before you get to all of that, you should be having this discussion about the prenuptial agreement.
Okay, so it doesn't need to go on my Bumble profile, but it should happen before the invitations are sent.
Exactly. Love the Bumble, actually.
Well, Lisa, it has been a joy to talk with you today. Thanks for unpacking all of the lessons learned from strangers, and thanks for educating me and all of us on all things prenups and postnups. Super interesting conversation.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure, and I hope that it's helpful to your audience.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Lisa. If you enjoyed this week's episode, be sure to hit that follow or subscribe button, and we'll see you next week on The Details.